you. Lovely to see you both.
See.
So I am going to start just with a little bit of information about suffrage movement, if that's okay, before we launch into the questions. So my name's Jennifer and I write and research about suffragettes, well, suffragists as well, there are two types. And I've got my two books here actually, if anyone wants to have a look later. But just really to give you a little bit of scene setting so that we can talk about that before we move to the political now. People, not just women, have been campaigning for votes for women for a long, long time, or had been, prior to getting that vote, or some of them getting the vote in 1918. So the research that I've done, and I based it initially in Kent, was based on an 1866 petition that was put together and put into Parliament, obviously calling for votes for women, but women were campaigning prior to that as well, some say as early as 1832, so it depends on what research you look at. But that petition itself included Kent, included women and men from Kent signing that petition, and like I said, it was the first time, it was a mass petition that was from around the country, and it was the first time that's happened. And we had a really innovative lady called Barbara Lee Smith Bodichon who came to Kent. She had a second home actually near Kent in Robertsbridge, and she used to collect her signatories for that petition rather than write letters like was the norm. And actually most of the signatories came from a place called Tenterden that you may have heard of, and that's because that's where she did her shopping. And she used to ask people when she was buying her groceries if they'd sign her petition. So she got tradesmen and women to sign that. So Kent had quite a different mix of signatories for that particular petition. So these women that campaigned in that way, they were peaceful, they didn't break the law. They were known as suffragists, and they were campaigning for many, many years before the suffragettes came on board. So Emmeline Pankhurst, she set up the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, 1903 in Manchester. She brought it to London in 1906, and that was a completely different approach. They did break the law, very much so. And my second book is more about that, actually, a particular mission where you know, they smashed glass and lots of different ways of working through for the cause, and you can imagine they didn't agree on their approaches, so there was quite a lot of fallout, and there were other leagues that started up as a result actually. Yeah, it's a very interesting sort of time to research and write about. I mean, I'm very passionate about it. I can't not mention this lady from Kent that I found when I was researching, because she is now kind of the person that I follow through everything I do. There was a lady called Ethel Violet Baldock, who was a working class maid. She was born in Gravesend, but she lived in Maidstone. But at age 12, she went off to be a maid. That's what she wanted to do. She wasn't very good at being a maid. She lost a lot of her jobs. And fortunately her family have kept together like postcards, and like they've got the Bible and her christening gown even, but they've got a little bit of a record about what she got up to. She was a bit of a character, and at 19 she ended up being arrested in London in 1912, and that was this big glass breaking mission that Emmeline Pankhurst led. So that's what my second book is mainly about. And Ethel is just, I always like to talk about her because she's representative of a lot of people. You know, she was working class, and she really stood up for what she was passionate about at a very young age. In fact, Emmeline Pankhurst always said she was too young to be in prison, because she used to say you had to be 21 or over to be in the front line. So she obviously flouted that law, that rule. So she was a character. So that's Ethel. And that's really suffrage. I mean, I could go on and fill a whole day, but I won't, because I really want to now talk to our guests. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was women MPs, and the fact that they were able to stand for the first time in 1918, weren't they? And then since 1918, there have been 693 female MPs. That's all, not many. So what I was going to ask is, Naushabah, what would you like to explain? Because you are an MP now, a female MP.
And as we've just confirmed,
yeah.
667th.
Yeah.
So, I think, Tracey, you were
305th.
Which is unbelievable. And the gap was, you were 2010.
2010, yeah.
in 2024. So.
Yeah. And how did it feel to be elected as a woman and to go into that role?
So for me, I mean, my background has been for quite some time. I've been in and around politics, and Tracey and I have known each other for quite some time because when Tracey was winning elections, I was losing them. So I remember when I actually did stand for election in 2014 and 2015 and lost both of those for Parliament. So it's been a bit of a journey, and I think I felt that I knew what there was to know about Parliament, and I'm going to lose that. What there was to know about Parliament, and because I'd been around it for a long time, I'd worked in Parliament in the past as well for other MPs, but actually going in there for the first time and realising just the gravity of the place, being told that I could sit on the green seats in the chamber, did actually felt quite overwhelming. It felt quite special, and I actually realised just how much the fact that I was in one of the world's greatest democracies, and regardless of political party, the decisions that I've made there, the choices that I've made, and what is delivered there, and the impact it has on lives, and some of the big things that have happened in that place. I think it was quite a sobering moment, really, for me, certainly. And I also have to admit, I did feel a slight bit of imposter syndrome, thinking, how has a girl from Gillingham ended up in Westminster? And then I think you have to realise your place in that space, what you're there to do, and what it is that's driven you to get there, and what it is that you want to do. And you just don't know how long you'll hold that role for. Who knows what happens with politics? But for me, it's about being able to have an impact and actually being able to go out there and try some of the things that I talked to the electorate about when I was campaigning.
Thank you, it's really interesting. And Tracey, you were an MP when we actually had a female Prime Minister. Can you tell us a little bit about that and your experiences?
Well, first of all, it's great to be back at the Hub and to see it thriving. Some familiar faces, so well done for carrying on what is an excellent and incredible community asset. So it's nice to be here. I mean, I have to say, I never really defined the Prime Ministers that I worked under via the gender. The party's very proud that we've had 3 female Prime Ministers, but ultimately, their actions are defined by the policy decisions and everything else rather than their gender. But nonetheless, it is. I think you still appreciate that it is an important moment in British politics, and I'm sure one day we will see a
hopefully
female leader of the Labour Party.
I'm hoping we get there sometime.
But it's quite extraordinary actually, because if you look at the statistics, we were just looking in the House of Commons Library Note, which is available to everyone, by the way. You can go onto House of Commons Library research documents and look at them. The Conservative Party has traditionally had fewer female MPs than the Labour Party, and yet we have had 3 female leaders. So that's sort of kind of a smaller pool for us to have selected those leaders from, and I think that's quite extraordinary in itself. But I, like Naushabah, did not come. I mean, I grew up in Hythe, went to school in Folkestone, family completely non-political. To find yourself suddenly walking, through Westminster as a member of Parliament is an honour and a privilege. I never really saw it through the lens of gender. I think I've grown more into a feminist as I've got older and suddenly realised the challenges that women have had to overcome. But I've never faced any of those challenges personally. So it's always now interesting to talk about it from a retrospective perspective.
Definitely. And you both touched on this idea of leadership, political leadership. And I know you said that you haven't experienced this kind of negativity, if you like, but can you say of any experiences you've had where, what factors affect women becoming leaders, political leaders, and what hinders and what supports them best, both ways?
So I think for me, I mean, I have faced some challenges, I think, growing up and sort of seeing, particularly coming from an Asian background, coming forward as a woman. There have been moments when people have been questioned about why I'm in certain rooms. Often in the past, when I've not necessarily always in politics, but when I've walked into, I've often worked in industries which are quite male dominated. I used to work in the development industry with, I used to work with developers and in regeneration projects at one point, and it's very male dominated. And I remember walking into rooms and people would always talk to my assistant and say, really welcome, really nice to meet you, when is Mr. Khan arriving? So I often get asked that all the time. I've had people call me and say, are you Mr. Khan's secretary? No, I am Miss Khan. So there's a bit of that happens, and I think sometimes it's, you know, people are very apologetic, and I don't think it's always done intentionally, but I think sometimes it is just the stereotype that they have in their mind about what a politician might look like or someone in this role might look like, and it probably isn't always someone who looks like me. So I think there has been a little bit of that, and I've certainly seen some of that as I've kind of navigated the world of politics. And I've had some incredible mentors, incredible people that have really encouraged me, and I think that's what's made the difference, because, and that's been across gender, that's not just been women, that's been men as well, who have played that role in saying, no, actually you can do this, because I think there's always a lot of questioning, there's always a bit like, do I belong here? And that's something that comes with confidence, but something you've got to overcome, and I'm really keen to make sure that other women feel that you know, I recognise my role in realising that I feel really privileged to be where I am, but I want to make sure other people who want that opportunity, other women who want that opportunity, have it as well. And I think some of the things that, when I speak to women in politics and what sometimes puts them off, certainly there is an imbalance when you see this, some of the way social media plays out. So there certainly is an imbalance in, and I've seen it from some of my colleagues who are quite exposed to this, people like Jess Phillips. They get some incredibly awful stuff said to them online. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen to those who are male, it does, but there is a difference. You know, there's a lot of talk about rape and things like sexual assault, just gets into this really nasty, vicious space because people feel they've got an anonymous face that they can hide behind and say what they like, and that is, I think, sometimes incredibly off-putting. I think politics still has its challenges in understanding how people's lives are. So there are those women that say to me, actually, I'd love to get involved, but I've got so much happening in my own life. I'm either looking after children, I've got elderly parents, and I just don't know if I'm going to be able to give this what I think it needs. And I think there is still some work that we need to do around that, in terms of realising that, you know, people's lives are going to be very different, and we all know that women tend to have more of the caring responsibilities in their families and kind of opening that space. But I do think sometimes how politics can feel toxic, and it certainly feels like it's not necessarily rowing back from that space. It tends to be going more in Parliament. I find people are incredibly respectful to each other across party. We work across, obviously we disagree on lots, and there'll be party political differences, but we find ways to be respectful to colleagues in those spaces, and actually you see that in the select committees and the committees that exist. Of course, in the chamber you get that kind of theatrical performance that happens, and there is to say there's a lot of passion. It's not to say that none of that is real, but I think generally people tend to work on the most in quite a collaborative fashion in order to do the right thing, and whether you've got a difference in opinion on how something should happen, you find ways to navigate that. But outside of that space, I think there's this wider political forum, which I think sometimes people do find quite off-putting, because it can feel, you know, you feel quite exposed. I think we were talking earlier about how one of the big differences in this job compared to any other job I've done is how personal it sometimes feels, because it is your name, your face, people see you, they come up to you and say, you know, and you've got to get used to that, and sometimes it doesn't always feel comfortable. For some people, you know, it's something they're very comfortable with, but for others it can be a bit challenging. And I think that exposure, for some, I think certainly it's something that some of the women I've spoken to say is it can feel a little bit daunting.
And makes you vulnerable, I
It does a little bit, yeah. It opens you up to that space, and you've got to sort of wear a bit of a thick skin and learn how to manage that in your own way, whatever works for you. But as I say, it's not something that everybody's always comfortable with from the
No.
start.
I imagine it's very hard. And how about you, Tracey? Would you say similar things to that?
So during my time, we had some really inflammatory issues,
Mhm.
some of the abuse that was levied at politicians was very much towards female MPs. And I think they did some analysis, and if you were a female Labour Jewish MP, you would get more death threats than any other MP. You know, people just can't limit their views to just general, you know, discourse. It has to then sort of become something more than that, and that is quite a horrendous aspect. But then on the other side, there have been some incredible champions of women in politics. I've actually found the people who have often been those who put the barriers in place are other women. So David Cameron, for example, was a massive champion of female MPs and candidates. And in the run-up to the 2010 election, he had put in place something called an A-list. So people who were selected, they weren't all women, by the way, but people who had been selected who had particular skills, traits that he really wanted to place into winnable seats, so they have more of a chance of becoming MPs. I remember seeing one of my favourite MPs that I'd worked with in the past at Maidstone toilets, glamorous. I was washing my hands, and Anne Widdecombe was there, and I said, "Hi Anne, how you doing?" And the first thing she said was, "You're not on this A-list, are you?" And I was like, "No, Anne, I'm not." She was like, "Good," and then walked off. I was like, "Okay, charming." But there was a generation, and I completely understand it, a generation of people who had overcome significant challenges to get into Parliament, and therefore I think had a little bit of resentment that there were some of those challenges were being removed for other women to get in. And I think that she saw, and I can completely understand this mindset, I think she saw that herself as more resilient to face challenges while she was there, because she had, you know, gone through difficult times to get there, and that she didn't think that others who didn't face those challenges would have the level of resilience that was needed to be an MP. And actually, in some cases, she would have been right. And we did see a lot of people in 2015 leave Westminster because they didn't like it, because it wasn't what they expected, because they were promised great things that hadn't materialised. That was very interesting, that we always think that the sisterhood are, you know, all one side, and they're not always.
No.
And politics can be an incredibly competitive environment, because there are many people that just want to travel up this ladder into cabinet and to greatness. And
If that's what you call it.
that's what you call it. And that's, you know, sort of kind of that you scrabble around with each other to do that.
Yeah.
I never wanted that, and I never actually went into the chamber and got caught up in the tribal and hostility that you can have. I was very much a cross-party consensus politician. All the issues that I ever worked on were ones that worked across all parties, whether it was sport or loneliness or community or whatever. I was always cross-party. So that was quite a nice sort of kind of aspect of it, really.
Yeah, sounds good. And actually, from the research I've done with the suffragettes and the suffrage movement, like you said about the sisterhood, they were definitely squabbling and fighting and falling out, and competition was rife. So it kind of makes sense.
I think the one thing that I struggled with until I was a bit older was actually understanding all those struggles, because, you know, I was brought up by my mother. My grandmother was very strong, present in my childhood. I went to an all-girls school with female leadership. We had the Queen and we had Maggie Thatcher, regardless of what people's views were. You know, she was still arguably the most powerful woman in the country. And therefore it just didn't occur to me, it never occurred to me that I couldn't do what I wanted to do, because I had all of these women in these places. And it was only when I was older and I was banned from playing in a football match in Parliament because I was a woman, that actually I started to piece together bits of things that now in hindsight I could see as a complete injustice, but at the time I was just shrugged my shoulders and got on with it. So I was banned from playing football with the boys at primary school. I didn't think anything of it because Anne will be completely unsurprised by this, but you know, the teacher would tell me to not play football with the boys. I'd say, okay, walk away. The teacher would walk off to tell somebody else and I'd go back and play again, right? So, you know, it was like, just crack on. I didn't see it as an injustice until I grew up, and then I thought, well, actually, where were all those girls' football clubs that are now everywhere? Why was it that I had to wait till I was 18 before I could play a competitive football match? And then you suddenly think, oh, and I wasn't allowed to do this, and why wasn't? And so I think now we can talk about the, you know, the sort of kind of burning injustice, but at the time I didn't feel it. I just cracked on with it.
So if you wouldn't mind, just
No,
on that.
carry
So
on.
I had a really interesting experience because it's really interesting. I grew up with incredible women in my life, my grandma, my mum, but I also grew up in a culture where it's not always as simple as that. And I realised, you know, obviously I was very encouraged by my father to go on and do things, but he used to say to me, look, he used to say this to me quite openly when I was a child. He was like, you're a woman, you're Asian, life's not always going to be easy, and you've got to go and be able to stand on your own 2 feet. And I saw lots and lots of examples culturally as well where that wasn't always the case, and it wasn't necessarily the same sort of level playing field for boys and girls. So I felt really different about it because my dad played a huge role in who I am today and why I felt that I could go on to be who I wanted to be. But it was really interesting for me because I went to an all-girls school, Fort Pitt, which I'm sure many of you know, but I went to an all-boys sixth form. I went to the maths school for sixth form that allowed 30 girls in. And I went there with some of my friends, and I went there, and that was a huge learning curve. At the age of 17, to suddenly being gone from an all-girls environment to this environment with lots of guys in it, really different culture. And for me, that was, I think, maybe when I really started to become, I mean, I've always been a feminist, but I really started to say, actually, this isn't okay. And I remember some of the challenges I faced. So I was in the running at the time. The school had never had, and I think it's changed quite a bit by now, but at that time, they'd never had a senior prefect who was a woman, and I was one of the first to do it. And I remember going to the conversations, and I remember the boys around me, some of who I thought were my friends, saying, oh God, a girl should never be getting this. This isn't right. This is a boys' school. You shouldn't be even in the running for this. And saying to me things like, you know, it doesn't make sense. And even the head teacher, who had similar, you know, not necessarily those views, but you could see there was like a slight undercurrent of this feeling that why should a girl be in this leadership role within our, you know, within this space? And I think it just made me more and more determined to prove that wrong. And I think I've had comments like that made to me throughout different things that I've done. So my first job out of university was at KPMG, and I remember when I got the role, I'd gone through an internship program at university and I'd got the role, so I was able to come out of university straight away and go into a graduate scheme. But when I got the role, a couple of the boys that I was at university with came up to me and said, you know, you only got that because you're a tick box exercise, because you're an Asian woman. And I get that a lot. You know, you're only here because you fill a quota or a criteria, not because you've got the skills or you've got the ability. And that makes you quite frustrated and angry. And I think that's something that has driven me to be more determined about what I do and not be afraid to have a space in a place where men think that it's their space. I think that definitely, the journey at school started that for me, because I was so used to, probably a bit like Tracey, like not really ever thinking that there was any issue with any of this. Obviously there was some cultural context to it, but as I said, I was incredibly lucky to have the father that I did. But going to sixth form was a game changer for me. It certainly made me think differently, because suddenly there was a lot of question marks about my gender and why I was in that space. Now, I'd love to think things have changed considerably since then. It was quite a while ago, much to my annoyance, but it was a long time ago now. But it certainly shaped me, I think, in terms of in that journey.
That's really interesting, really interesting. I just wanted to move on a little bit, if I can, just really more about perhaps what's driven you to be involved in politics, both of you. I'm thinking really, if you link back to the suffrage movement, a lot of the women that were involved, and there's quite a local woman, Dame Kathleen Courtney from this area, was involved very much in the suffrage movement, but she was also a massive advocate for like poor law reform and trying to improve the lives of women and girls. And they really believed that by getting the vote for women, it would help change that significantly, which it did, in my opinion. But I just wondered, based on that, they were doing that for other people. They were driven by the desire to improve things for other people. I'd imagine that is what is involved in being a politician. And I just wondered if you could touch on that for us, please.
Yes, absolutely. So for me, again, I think it came from my experiences growing up. So grew up in Gillingham, born and brought up there, and came from a family that actually isn't incredibly wealthy by any means, and always faced challenges. But you know, and this is where my politics come from, and other people will have different views on this. But certainly for me, growing up, this is what determined my politics. I felt that when government, you know, the Labour government came in at the time, it actually did have a transformative impact on my family and my life. And I don't think that I would have had some of the opportunities that I've had today if it hadn't been for that, because my parents were incredibly encouraging, but they'd never been to university. They worked incredibly hard, but they really, you know, the big driver for them is that we want our children to have a better life than we did. And I think that is the underlying principle that guided us as a family. But that wasn't always easy to achieve. They also saw education as a big kind of playing a big role within that. But for me, I think really, I mean, look, I always had an interest in politics. I don't think there are many 11-year-olds that watch the general election result come through. I realised that was a bit of an anomaly. But I don't think I ever really saw myself in that world. So I was interested in it. I certainly used to see these big decisions happening, and I remember when I was at school, one of the things that I really got passionate about was the Iraq War. I actually protested against it at the age of 16. But I don't think I ever really saw myself playing a role within party politics in the way that I now do, obviously. But what I started to realise, I went to university and I got quite involved, and there were lots of things that I was trying to change. And I did quite a lot of work with charities and so on. And I realised quite quickly that actually you're only ever touching around the edges with that. If you want systemic, far-reaching change that impacts communities like the one that I grew up in, then the way you do that is through politics. And I'm not saying that always happens in the right way, or we always make the right decisions, and that's you know, across parties. But it is still the way that you determine and change for the communities that you represent. And I think I really recognised that when I moved back from university as well and came back to live in Medway. I'd always promised myself I would never come back. That was it. I was gone. I'm not coming back here. But I came back and I realised that this is my home, and this is the place that has huge challenges actually in some ways, but it also has opportunities. And the way that you get to that, the way that you make other people, you know, I feel incredibly lucky that I've ended up having the career that I've got, that I've had the opportunities that I've had, but I want other people to have them as well. I want other people who have my background and my upbringing to have that. And that's what got me involved in politics, because I think I want to be able to drive that forward myself.
So I wasn't the classic child reading election results at the age of 11. I was too busy.
I'm quite clear that was a very odd thing for me to do.
Yeah, I was too busy being feral. I'm a complete accidental politician. I was choosing my A-levels and I couldn't do maths with history, so I switched maths for politics. That was it. That's literally how I got into it. And then it was quite interesting. So you've revealed your age, I'm about to reveal mine. John Major had just become Prime Minister. And I found him quite inspiring. I know lots of people think he's very boring, but he was from a single parent family, he'd gone to grammar school, and he'd risen up to be Prime Minister. And I actually thought that was a really interesting journey. And, you know, if someone like that could do it, then I would be, you know, I could do that. Not that I've ever wanted to be Prime Minister. But that was the kind of start, the conversations that we were having at school. My MP was Michael Howard, and he came into school one day and my best friend Emma basically made a bit of a wally of herself, and for some reason, and I have no idea why, I wrote to him to apologise for her behaviour, and said that I actually found his talk really interesting, and he wrote back and he offered me some work experience in London. He was Home Secretary at the time, and I went up to London and I did work experience with him, and then I followed him around on the Friday and the Saturday around the constituency, which I lived in, and I found that side of things really interesting. My mum's a social worker, and there's a real sort of kind of similarity between what an MP does and what a social worker does, and so I guess there was an inherent compassion for other people and helping them through their problems and challenges. But didn't really think much more of it. Went to university to read law, and then discovered that actually I could do law and politics, and the politics course and the law course were pretty much the same. So I'd get a joint degree for half the amount of study, and I thought, well, that sounds great. That means I can play football more. So I just carried on the journey of, politics.
So you switched again, did you?
So I switched again to law and politics, and then I was supposed to be, I was in my final year, and I was supposed to be filling out my application to do my conversion course at law school, and we had a Tory politician come and speak to the Conservative students, which I only really joined to annoy all my friends, because I was at Hull, there were very few Tory people. They used to burn effigies of John Major, and I'd go up to people and say, "You're very childish," and then have to run really fast. And so anyway, we had this visiting politician, and I was walking him back to his car, because that was the responsibility of the vice chair, because I was too lazy to be chair, the vice chair. And I walked him back to his car and I said, "Don't suppose you fancy giving me a job, do you?" And he went, "Well, yeah, actually, I don't mind. When do you finish?" And I was like, "Oh, okay." So I had to send in my CV, and I did my last exam on the 7th of June in 1996, and started working in the House of Commons on the 10th of June 1996. And that was so literally everything was just, a convenience, an accident on the way. Sorry.
No, that's
been
that
plotting
is
this
just
since
some
you
people
were
had. And I wasn't plotting at all.
since you were 11, and I was just like, "Yeah, do you perhaps give me a job?"
No, I wanted to be an astronaut at 11.
No.
I just liked watching the. I wrote to NASA asking if they'll have me, and they said no.
Oh.
But I didn't take that route.
You should have said your friend was really embarrassing.
There's still time.
Don't know if I want to go up there now.
But yeah, I mean, I found Michael was a real inspiration, and I still stay in touch with Michael, and he's always been a mentor to me. I saw him the other day actually, and it's just so nice to continue that journey, and I think he's very proud of what I've achieved. From the schoolgirl that he first plucked out of Folkestone Girls' School at 16. I mean, I have to say he's a smart cookie, because before I knew it, I was signed up to the Young Conservatives and out delivering his leaflets. But so there was more of it, but yeah, it was never planned.
Right, so completely different stories. I just wondered about empowerment as well. Like, I'm thinking again about the suffrage movement, where they use lots of different means to get members, to empower women through fundraisers, meetings, they'd have protests and things like that. But in terms of empowering not only other women or other people, could be men as well, but yourselves, how do you go about that?
I think seeing is believing, for starters, when it comes to other people. I mean, when I first got elected, I was the only female MP in Medway.
Yeah.
So we have Mark in Rochester and Ray in Gillingham. And a lot of the schools would ask me to go and speak to them to talk about women in politics. And I think sometimes that was the first time that people might have had their own stereotypes sort of kind of smashed. Yeah. I did actually take that role very seriously. But it is more than just gender. There is background, there is, sort of socio-economic aspects and everything else. I remember going to Strood Academy, as it was then, and literally asking the girls, they'd gathered the girls of the whole school into the hall, and asking them to put up their hands if they thought all politicians were rich. And they put up their hands, and hands up if you think all politicians are posh, and they put up their hands. Hands up if you've ever met a rich, posh Tracey right? Because that was the kind of, because actually, you know, it's like not everything you see, and the problem is that actually our leadership often comes from a very small pool, in both parties actually, of sort of kind of privately educated, quite wealthy, everything, lawyers, you know, everything's kind of fallen into place for them. And I think sometimes when we're talking about how that empowerment is basically showing what the whole of Parliament is, and Parliament is so bad at communicating all the excellent things that it does. Most people only tune into Westminster for Prime Minister's Question Time, which is the most awful advert for British politics. And in fact, I stopped going to PMQs and used to go to a yoga class instead, because it was actually far more zen, because it's also the least important part of the week. You know, it's like basically people just shouting and pointing. It's not very attractive. If you want to ask the Prime Minister a question, you can see them in a vote anyway. So, you know, that's what
I enjoyed asking my question.
I don't tune in. I literally don't tune in anymore. But well done. Oh, it's quite a scary moment.
It's quite.
So I think that in terms of empowerment, it's about setting a good example. It's about showing that you're there. It's about smashing lots of ceilings, not just the one relating to gender. And I think it's about, you know, really enabling the next generation to come through by continuously smoothing their path. And showing that it is a really important profession to get involved in. And it's also not just in Westminster. You know, the stats in this document here, we have fewer female councillors, which I've always thought the council, and Sham's been on council, I've not, but you know, getting it right at local level is so important. You know, making sure that the things that really affect the community, those micro decisions around streets, hedges, litter, all that sort of stuff, is just as important as, you know, being up in Westminster.
Yeah. And what about getting people involved in politics? How about, like, experience-wise, how can they get involved, and what ideas have you got for that?
So I mean, I agree with a lot of what Tracey says around being able to visualise and see that, and I think I'm really quite proud about the fact that this cabinet, it does feel different. There are, you know, and that kind of private school background and that, like, those stereotypes that Tracey mentioned. Then, you know, I'm not suggesting it doesn't exist, of course it does, but that there is a real kind of step change in this Parliament. It does feel like that. Certainly when you walk around, and we just had a picture taken in International Women's Day with all the MPs together, and it did feel incredibly strong, and not just women from one type of background, but lots of different types of backgrounds. And I had the privilege of hearing people's maiden speeches, which is actually one of the really nice things about being an MP, is when you get to hear colleagues around you give their first speech, and they're not designed to be too overly political, and they're designed to be there to kind of give a bit of a flavour about your background, what motivates you to get into politics, and just the breadth of experience. You know, people from different walks of life, different things that they've done, social workers, teachers, doctors, people who have not had any of those experiences but have had huge challenges in their life, with, and just lots and lots of different experiences in terms of what they'd grown up with. I think was incredible to hear, and I was like, that felt quite unusual in terms of what we see. So I think that is something to be proud of. I think within politics itself, for me, the big thing has been, and I talked a bit about this earlier, I mean, I remember going into my first sort of meetings in the Labour Party and sort of being the only woman, the only person of colour, and possibly the only person under the age of 50. So it was, not that there's any issue with that, but it was just, you know, you do feel quite sort of exposed, I think, and you just think, oh right, how do I, you know, do I feel confident enough to say something? Do I feel confident enough to speak up? Are the conversations that they're having, are they even relevant to me? You know, are they talking about the issues that impact that I'm currently facing, which is you know, just left school, looking for all of these sorts of things that I think sometimes in politics we still have journeys to make. But so one of the things that I've been really, really keen to do is try and open up a bit more. So ahead of the local elections that we had in 2023, and Tracey's right, I actually did spend a lot of my time as a local councillor. So I was a local councillor for almost 10 years. And that has been an incredible learning curve for me, because when I first stood for election for Parliament, I hadn't been a councillor, and I feel I feel the journey that I've been on, not just being a councillor, but being a bit older and having got those grey hairs and started to sort of see a little bit about what happens, you know, how I can impact change. I feel so different now. This time around when I stood for election, I felt incredibly different to when I stood 10 years ago. But the experiences I got as councillor were really formative for me personally. But one of the things I wanted to do is ensure that more women felt that they had a space, and younger people felt that they had a space, and people from different walks of life felt they had a space. So we ran a number of training sessions actually, and sort of said to people quite early on, look, you might never have had any experience in politics, you might never have joined a political party, you probably did not care what was happening at 2 o'clock in the morning on an election night on BBC One. But you know, you play a huge role in your community, you've been doing all of this work, are you interested in finding out more? And actually we had people coming along and just saying, okay, I'm interested, I want to see what difference I can make, but I've never really thought about politics in that way. And we had some really good conversations and started to sort of hear a bit more from people's life experiences and the questions that they had, some of the fears that they had, and just creating that sort of space where those conversations could happen, where they felt comfortable doing that, rather than having to come to their first meeting ever and there's lots of procedural things going on, lots of points of order, not really knowing how things work and expected to find a role within that. And I think for me that kind of opportunity to have those more informal conversations, build your own sort of tribes as well, one of the things that's kept me going in politics, because it is tough and you know, sometimes it can feel quite lonely actually. You feel quite exposed, you can be on the front line. It's finding the people that you feel that you can trust and speak to, whether that's family or the friends or your network within politics, where you feel that you can have those conversations, you can sort of sense check things, you can ask opinions, and do that comfortably. And for me, it was so important to find those people around me that would be, I guess, what I call my tribe. And I think it's important to help people create that for others as well. And I think that's what keeps you going in politics. It can be tough, but having other people encouraging you, and that's across gender, as I say. Some of the people that encouraged me to stand and gave me the encouragement, you know, said, actually, no, you can do this, don't second guess yourself, were men.
Yeah.
And I think Tracey picked up on that point, that sometimes women can be, for whatever reasons, can be a bit dismissive in terms of or think that, well, we had to work quite hard to get here, so we expect you to have to do the same. And I understand that, but actually, if we want to kind of make this a space where people feel they can come forward, then we've got to change that. We've got to change that culture. So yeah, I think the mentoring, I've always said to people, if you want mentoring support, that's something I'm really happy to do. Learning about the job, there's no question that's silly or stupid, like, you know, and just get to know it, get to kind of meet people. I would always say to people, you know, I love going to schools and talking to younger people about this, because I think that's something that I should do as someone who grew up here. I think it's my job to go out and say, actually, look, if me as a girl from Gillingham can do this, so can you. If it's something you want to do. I
think it's about changing over time. Ed. I think that one of the things I take very seriously is is how the example I give to my son. Right? I'm the main worker in the house. Steve works incredibly hard, but he's home most of the week, whereas I'm away most of the week. And those stereotypical jobs are completely reversed in our house. And you know, I'm the sporty one in the house, you know, and Steve's the one that does the cooking, and I'm the one that went off into politics, you know, and Steve's the creative one. So I think there's you know, it's about basically challenging those stereotypes, but over time, not just for women, but also for our young men as well, who I think are gonna grow up in an incredibly different environment than boys, men before them. So I think that's, you know, an important aspect. I also think it's about remaining authentic, and Naushabah was saying about being in rooms where you don't know whether or not your voice is going to be taken seriously. Sometimes I found the most powerful thing was not forcing myself to have a view or an opinion on things that I didn't, just because there was an expectation that I ought to be saying something. And I quite liked going into rooms with all these men who were sitting there talking utter nonsense, and not saying anything at all, or just saying something that's very small or different. So I remember being in a meeting with George Osborne, who wasn't the one talking nonsense, I just quickly clarify, and a lot of them were talking about the macroeconomic impact of something or other. And the only thing I kept on thinking about was, well, what does this mean to people and their purse? You know, actually, when you strip out all of this macroeconomic stuff, what does it actually mean for the mother, the father, whoever going off to buy their shopping? And, you know, it is sometimes just, that's the bit that's important. I also think the final point I'd make is about championing those that are in those challenging roles. I regularly text the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and Liz Kendall to wish them well in whatever it is that they're about to announce, because Rachel's the first female Chancellor, and I might not agree with her politically, but she gets more abuse than any other Chancellor before her because she's a woman. And so I messaged her. I messaged Liz this week just to, again, I might have a different view on welfare reform, but nonetheless, that was an important announcement for her to make. And it's just like, you know, I hope it goes well for you today. Those are the little things that you can do for other women, regardless of your own political tribe.
Lovely. Well, I think we're going to finish on that good note. Thank you so much, both of you. It's been a pleasure. I think we might open up to questions if you're okay.
Yeah.
What's the current ratio of female-male MPs holding seats in the House of Commons?
I've got it in the
Tell
library
you.
stats. It's 263 female MPs of 650. So,
Okay.
So it's better. It's 40%. Sorry, I knew that figure off the top of my head. I don't need to look at that.
so it's massively improved and changed.
But in the history of since 1918, like 5,600 something odd MPs have been elected, of which only 683 have been female.
Right.
And I was the 305th female MP to get elected, so from 1918 to 2010, so nearly 100 years.
Right.
But in that time, there have been another 300 something odd on top of that, so that's
Right.
doubled.
And I'm 667, so that gives you an idea. Yeah.
Who's 666?
Don't know, but I'm glad it's not me. It's not just. Let's find that out.
Yeah, interesting.
It's interesting, years ago, I mean, my father was born in 1917, how he revered the Queen, and yet when Margaret Thatcher as a woman came in power, he would not accept it.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
I suppose he maybe thought, well, the Queen hasn't got the authority and power to make decisions, she's guided by men in his mind, but then Margaret Thatcher's like, how could a woman be Prime Minister? No.
No.
I think the one that I always find interesting is when people say, oh, well, we had one female Prime Minister and she did this, and no, it's not one, but you know, that kind of, well, we had a female and she did this, so we can never have one again. I was like, except all the men that have held these roles, and yet we don't go, they were terrible, so we'll never have a male Prime Minister ever again. That doesn't seem to work quite the same way.
No. Yes.
Do you think that there's still hostility in terms of, well, firstly in terms of women, but secondly in terms of people with disabilities, which is intersectional, and in terms of trying to get them into Parliament to become MPs and represent people?
So certainly in Westminster, I don't think there is hostility. I think there may still be societal views that need to be challenged, but I think they are very small. I mean, I certainly have never been on the doorstep and people saying, I'm not voting for you because you're a woman. I did have someone write to me when I had my breast cancer diagnosis to tell me that I should immediately step down because I could possibly carry on being an MP going through cancer treatment. They got short shrift. So people have their prejudices, but I think there's societal prejudices rather than anything that potentially exists in the House of Commons. There are actual physical barriers that the parliamentary estate tries to overcome with disability. So we have over course of many years had people with varying types of disability, and the authorities tried to make sure that they have as smooth as possible sort of experience of being in Parliament. So if they're physical, then they're on the same floors as the voting chambers, there are lifts and everything else. But their experience of getting around the parliamentary estate is not as easy or as smooth as it is for able-bodied parliamentarians. But I don't think that inside the House, inside Parliament, that there's hostility, and I think anything outside is just ignorant in terms of people's views on women or disability full stop, rather than the profession.
Maybe hostility is a strong word to use then. Would it be more that there's lack of awareness with certain disabilities? So for example, I'm dyslexic, so if you gave me a piece of paper to read,
Yes.
and it was in a posh looking font, I wouldn't be able to read that, but you wouldn't know particularly to have that awareness maybe to say, oh well, we'll have this font because there might be some people in the audience that are dyslexic. So is that something that we need to try and address? I've attended some of the learning committees in Parliament for I think it was Sharon Osborne and Lord, I can't remember his name now, it's gone out of my head. But anyway, in the committee meetings, and that seems to be some of the issues, and trying to get people actually in those committee meetings to actually listen to what should be taken forward.
I think there are still some, so I think Parliament sometimes does feel a little bit like we're still sort of 20 years behind some other workplaces when it comes to how some of this works. I think wherever possible they're trying. So for example, in this Parliament, we've got a blind MP. He's a Liberal Democrat, and he brings his guide dog Lucy into the chamber. She tried to cross the floor the other day. That was really interesting. Just have a little look at that. I think she's getting a lot of love from the Labour side, and they had to come and get her. But equally, I also have a colleague of mine who has severe disabilities, and she was born with them. Obviously, they're very visible, and she's a newly elected MP, and she's had to sort of. She's had to ask for quite a bit, but where those adjustments have been asked for, they've done everything they can to make them. But I think some of the nature of Parliament, there's such an old building, how some of it operates, I think there's almost feels like there needs to be a bit of a constant reminder. Like, I think there are still some things that we do that haven't quite caught up with where other workplaces, as an example, have managed to find reasonable adjustments a bit quicker and recognise some of those challenges. And you talked about dyslexia and things like that, and how things are printed where we never get anything on yellow paper, because but I'm sure if you asked for it you could, it's just they haven't thought about it in that context. So I think there's a little bit of work to do in that frame, and I think certainly with this Parliament, having people who have come from where we have got more reasonable adjustments to be made, and people with disabilities, I think they are learning. But it is a bit of a learning curve, and I would argue we're still a little bit behind on some of these things. Just in terms of my own experiences, I mean, obviously, I think you're right about the hostilities and prejudices. I wouldn't say I necessarily get too much on the doors directly to me around being a woman. I certainly get a lot more on my race though, and a lot of people have, my team people have knocked on the door for me and they've said we're never voting for an immigrant. So I do get things like that. So I do think there are still some challenges out there, but I won't go into that today. But just to kind of give that context.
But that's awful. Thanks for sharing that. It's an awful experience.
It's a very daily occurrence for me, the amount of racism I get. So I think you get used to it.
Because your dresses are public, aren't they, as well?
Although you can ask for them to be removed.
Right,
I was a counsellor.
That's only now though, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the reasons I decided to step down was because of the number of death threats I was getting. So and I just didn't want my son to grow up in an environment where we had bulletproof doors and bulletproof windows and spy holes and all that nonsense. And there are moments that happen, Israel Gaza being the latest, where people just don't have the ability to deal with their views in some people, should I say, not everyone, but some people have very extreme views, and that then comes into threats of violence.
I think for me that's been the biggest journey actually, because as you say, I was a counsellor for 10 years and I was very used to going out and doing street surgery, standing in the high streets, not thinking a second about it, really, if I'm honest. I mean, my address has been public for a long time through the council website, various things, and I think perhaps I just hadn't realised, but the shift change to when you become an MP. I mean, now obviously we've had 2 MPs that have been murdered, partially sadly, and the security is so high. So I'm not, we're just not allowed to do street surgery without security present, which for me feels incredibly strange because this is my hometown. This is why can't I just stand here and. But then equally, I do recognise why that's happening, as you say, Tracey, like having the security team come in and put CCTV in your house, put emergency alarms in, things like that does feel a bit like, oh, really? What if what does this mean? But I also recognise why they do it. But there has been, you do feel more exposed, I think, because you are, your face is out there, you're in the public eye. It doesn't take much for people to work out where you might be and where you are. So it does create a different sense and feel around it. And I think some of the social media things as well, with the death threats that have been received, I'm really lucky that I haven't received anything like that to date, but I certainly get a lot of vitriol. And you think it just takes, you just don't know what might flip. And I know other female MPs who have received some really, really horrific stuff. So that is definitely one of the downsides of the job. But I don't want to end on that because it is actually an incredible job. And I think perhaps underneath all of this, I just want to say I really love it. And I think I don't want to lose that in this conversation about some of the challenges that we face.
Yeah, but important to recognise them as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing all of that. It's been amazing. I think we've come to an end now.
Can I just say one thing?
You can.
I was a governor at the maths school when you were just arriving, girls into the sixth form, and I fought a lot as a governor for making sure that the girls' toilets were suitable, and also that their PE was suitable, because you weren't going to play rugby or whatever at that,
Maybe chase
at
them.
that time.
Yeah.
So I know what you went through. The other thing, just to say, I think Craig McKinley, if he continued as an MP, would have probably had quite an effect on the disability side.
He's in
Within,
House of Lords
He's in
now.
Lords.
yes, but not in the Commons, is
Well,
he?
what frustrates me about your point about dyslexia is actually there are dyslexic MPs, but they quite often feel that they can't speak out because somehow you're judged on that. And what frustrated me when Matt Hancock came out and started talking about his dyslexia, albeit after his fall from grace, what was frustrating was that had he started to talk about that in 2010 when he was elected, he could have affected real change.
Yeah.
And he didn't. And there are people that suddenly become interested in something, suddenly talk about things that have been a huge part of their lives, but have been too embarrassed to talk about it. And I think, wow, if you haven't gone into Parliament to talk about some of these issues that you've been victim of, that you can speak of more authentically than others, then what are you there for? And I think that we've had colleagues that get very passionate about autism because either they've had been somewhere on the spectrum or their child has, and I really applaud that. I think it's fantastic because they know more about it than anybody else, and dyslexia is a classic example.
I think that's right. I think sometimes people are good at representing others but not themselves, and so they feel stigmatised and they don't want to say anything, but they're happy to represent other people.
But therein lies the problem that you're always going to have a stigma around that particular condition, and people who have got the authority and the voice to be able to say it don't say it.
Yeah.
So anyway, as Naushabah said, it's a job that can be challenging, but it's one that also equally rewarding.
But just bouncing off Sam, in your local constituents area, the groups that you are running, there's lots of people that run these groups that have these disabilities. Like I've got FND and I run a neurological group. We would be quite happy to come and speak to people, so Parliament actually know what it's like to live with that condition, like they've just done the PIP thing. That's going to affect a lot of people's lives, and it's going to drop a lot of people in poverty. And to live with that condition's terrible. And like Sam with dyslexia, I've got FND.
I've got
FND. You've got FND. And we get out of a car and people look at us like to say, why are you parking that in disabled bay? There's nothing wrong with you. And like in Parliament, you've got people that suffer with those conditions, they don't talk about it. I had one of the
roles that I had locally, which was a real privilege actually, was to be the independent chair of the Physical Disability Partnership Board for Medway Council. And I really enjoyed it because I learnt something every single meeting. It was effectively set up to try and persuade, to try and encourage better communication on Medway Council decisions making. So it was everything from blue badge reforms through to, one of my favourites was that the Natural England came to talk to us about the new coast path that they were putting in, and then put in swing gates, which of course if you're in an electric wheelchair you can't. So it was like, and it was a real privilege to do that, and I was there because they, the users, really wanted an independent voice from the council. But actually I think I probably got more out of it because I could take those learnings back to Westminster. So I think it's really important for members of Parliament to really get into their community, to understand their community. But I also think there is an onus as well on groups like yours to invite your local MP to meetings, because actually
you have invited me, haven't you? So I will come along.
But the thing is there are thousands of community groups discussing a whole suite of different things, and we can't know about them all. We can't know about them all. So and I think there is this. Well, you never come and see us. You've never invited me. So I think that's the thing, is to encourage groups to invite.
Yeah, because it's important, because it's the likes of us that have people come to us with like major decisions like PIP and all of that, and it's like, well, we're settling their anxiety and things like that.
And just on that PIP question, I think it's been a huge conversation, and I completely recognise that everybody's sort of, what does this mean? That the final decisions that haven't been made, so I would love to come and see you before that gets further progress in Parliament, so we can do exactly that, and I can feed back and say, actually, I'm not the final, I'm not Ms. Kendall, however, I'm really keen to take back people's real life experiences and make sure that is fed back into this decision making process as your MP. So I'd be very happy to come and have those conversations, because I think you're right, that's what my job is, and we've got to make sure that what's happening here is taken back to Westminster, otherwise it stops working. If you don't have that golden thread, and that applies for everything that we're doing.
That'd be fantastic.
Can I ask a funny question? Well, it might be funny, it might not be funny, it might be serious, I don't know. Why is it that when MPs are on question time that they never answer the question?
Do you know what I think it is? I think we're so fearful of getting tricked up by the media and what that then's going to look like. I try my best when I can to answer the question, because I think it's so important that we do. But there's sometimes when you're sitting there and you're going, I'm representing myself, but I'm also representing my party, I'm also representing this. I don't know, and what are you going to do with this? And are you going to make it into something? And I think there's some of it is about trying to get to a space where you feel comfortable and confident, being able to say, actually, I disagree with this, or so on. But it is tough sometimes, particularly if you're a government minister, I think. And I think you do feel like you just get into this space where you think everyone's trying to trip me up all the time, and I think sometimes people end up feeling a little bit like they can't be honest with what they feel. I know Tracey was very good at doing that.
I didn't do it once.
She was quite,
I didn't do it once. I refused to do question time, I remember being asked a question. I was doing 5 Live. I was sports minister at the time, and Nikki Campbell, who I'm actually really good in outside of politics, Nikki Campbell asked me a question about something to do with the health service. I said, I've no idea. And he said, well, you should know. And I was like, well, I'm not the health minister, I'm the sports minister. And one of actually, I think it was the chief constable at the time, sent me a text message to say he heard the slap from May Stone, because I was just like, I don't know. And I think sometimes the problem is, you'd have to be quite brave to turn around and say, I don't know the answer to that, because it's not my responsibility. You can ask me about, the results for Man U versus Spurs, or you can ask me about, or you can ask me about a, significant piece of sports policy. But I'm not going to sit there and justify why the doctors are going on strike on whatever, because it's nothing to do with me, right? And you are given lines to take, I hadn't read them. So
At least you're
it was
honest.
just easier to say I don't know.
Yeah.
So
But that,
that's
you have to have
really
the confidence to do that, and I think there is, you know, for a lot of people, it just, they think what they don't want is the next headline being like, minister doesn't know what they're talking about, like, and obviously it didn't happen in that context, but that's kind of what you then open yourself up for. So I think there is this just a bit of a, and then social media as well, again, has played, I think, a wider role in how we sort of, you don't suddenly want to become the meme of the day. I know it sounds terrible, but there is this huge amount of pressure, I think, and I think that's why people sometimes feel, but honestly, I mean, it's not always possible, but I try my best to be as honest as I can about what I think and feel. But you also recognise that you're there to represent your party and government as well, and that comes with it another stress. So sometimes I think for some MPs, I've seen them, I just like, probably best if they just don't do it at all. and you know, but I do think that is the challenge that we face, because people feel like they never get a clear answer, and I think sometimes that.
I think it's important
Yeah.
for respect, though.
Exactly.
We would respect, as Tracey
And
said,
honesty,
honesty
absolutely.
far more
Yeah.
than waffling on
Yeah.
and feeling, well, they didn't answer any
Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, no, I
That's
agree.
the
I
lack
don't
of
disagree. I
respect.
just think there comes with this pressure. I'm just trying to a sense of why sometimes you think people struggle a little bit.
And one of the nicest things about not being a parliamentarian anymore is I don't have to have an opinion on everything.
And you don't have to look
I
after
can
that.
actually say I don't care, which is wonderful. There's so much more headspace.
Oh, that's great. Right, I'm going to wrap it up this time. I've tried 3 times.
That's it, well done.
So
Yeah,
passionate.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah,
for.
Thank you.